The podcast episode you are about to listen to was researched and produced by Mark Anthony Wyatt, copyright Leviathan Media Productions 2023.
And this is what I played for him.
She's a pretty bird, she warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Hi, I'm Mark. Welcome to episode 20 of the Cuckoo Town podcast, Fairy Films, We Folk on the Big Screen. The Fairy Films book was a very long time in the making. Over 3 years, due to many unforeseen problems and many gremlins in the machine too. And to be honest, I'd almost given up on it ever seeing the light of day. However, with hindsight now, I can see that perhaps the time wasn't right for the book. Maybe certain things had to be in place, and certain people had to move on to other projects elsewhere. Perhaps someone had offended the gentry. They don't like us talking about them, you know. Perhaps the good folk themselves, working through Joshua, were the final editors, overseeing our project. Maybe they were feverishly reading our essays behind the scenes, correcting us here and there, and possibly deleting any bits that didn't flatter them, or that they just didn't like. They were probably exasperated at Joshua's perseverance on our behalf, hoping that we'd just give up on the book, tired of constantly resisting us pesky humans, but gradually realising that we weren't going to go away any time soon. And so they had eventually relented, and they gave us, at a stroke, our Fairy Films book. The publishers at Educated Dragon, with help from the Fae no doubt, not only did a highly professional job on putting this book together, but they also came up with eye-catching new artwork designed by Natania Barron for the book's cover. Joshua Cutchin, well known and respected in the folklore and high strangeness research and writing field, worked extremely hard and patiently to help us all present our best work to the project, to produce essays of the highest quality to be enjoyed by the more open-minded and discerning reading public. And whilst doing all of that, he was also researching and writing his own contribution to the Fairy Films book, the essay about the film Borgman. There are 11 essays in all to enjoy, and the films discussed within those essays include, but are not limited to, The Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Borgman, Blue Velvet, Lord of the Rings, The Straight Story, Photographing Fairies, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Dune, Disney films generally, Marabito, The Hallow, The Hole in the Ground, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, and Twin Peaks. I hope you'll agree that there's something there for everyone. The essayists are Joshua Cutchin, Dr. Jack Hunter, Dr. Neil Rushton, Susan Demeter, Patrick Dugan, Dr. David Floyd, Alison Jornalin, James P. Nettles, Dr. Simon Young, Ren Collier, and me, Mark Anthony Wyatt. Apologies to anyone if I mispronounced their names, I'm sure I did. Many listeners to this podcast may be unaware that some, perhaps even many of the films that they have enjoyed in the past were imbued, if not entirely saturated, with fairy folklore. But don't reproach yourself if you hadn't noticed it, as it's not always so obvious. In fact, the fairy influence is often quite subtle, but not so much if you were to look again at those films through the fairy lens now. But a gentle warning to you: once you see the fairy folklore in films, you can't unsee it, and you'll be looking for it in the most unlikely places too, and probably finding it. I know I do. That's the power of this book. I should, in the interests of honesty and transparency, just add here that I haven't read all of the essays in Fairy Films yet, but I am slowly working my way through the book. So far, I have read Dr. Jack Hunter's brilliant Through a Crystal Darkly, cultural, experiential and ontological reflections on fairy, and I really enjoyed it. Joshua's outstanding I Am, We Are, decoding the fairy motifs of Alex van Wormadam's Borgman, which was fascinating, and Dr. Neil Rushton's exceptional Handmaidens of the Eternal, Consciousness and Death in Photographing Fairies. Now, the last two that I just mentioned, Joshua's and Neil's, inspired me already to watch Borgman and Photographing Fairies respectively, and I hadn't heard of either film before reading their essays. There's magic in these essays that will enchant you. These writers will hold you spellbound with their deep research and personal thoughts on fairy folklore in films. Now, when Joshua approached me to write an essay for fairy films, I was proud that he'd asked me. It's one thing to self-publish your own books, as I have done a few times, but it's quite another thing to be asked to contribute to a collection of essays by someone with such a highly respected name in this folklore field. And not only that, but to write alongside such high-achieving academic people too. I just wish my mum and dad had still been around to see me take part in this book. Anyway, I think that now might be an opportune time to read you Joshua's excellent introduction to fairy films we folk on the big screen. We act like the world is modern. Don't get me wrong, in many respects it is, with quite a bit to like. Within 24 hours, I can be on the other side of a planet if I choose to do so, riding in an automated vehicle with self-heated seats, all while carrying the Library of Alexandria in my pocket. Contemporary advancements deserve all the accolades heaped upon them, from trivial matters of convenience to life-saving medical treatments. With this comes hubris, however. We are the pinnacle of human evolution, we think. Every technological advance sweeps away the detritus of superstition, we think. Each new wave of scientific understanding casts light into the darkest recesses of existence, we think. But our current environment, at the very least, the way its inhabitants think, is not modern. Modernity is a story we repeat because it comforts us. It grants us the veneer of sophistication, the appearance, but our superstitions have been stripped away. But scratch the surface, and you will find that the old ways never truly left. We just hid them. Our silly world has covered ancient beliefs in a sophisticated glamour, no less potent than the most convincing magical illusion. What, pray tell, do I mean by this? For illustration, consider a predictable example, given the book you hold in your hands: the good neighbours, the fair folk, the gentry, the fairies. Few people believe in their existence, and that small handful is often hard-pressed to admit as much in mixed company. Modernity has obliterated the fairies from serious thought and discussion entirely. Nothing remains of them, save the amusements of children. Or so we are told. But remember, the old ways never truly left. The wee folk retreated from the hills and dales of our landscape into our culture, where they yet remain. Simply take a look at language. The small mouth noises that we make are poor placeholders for the actual ineffable nature of reality. Even if we ignore this fundamental truth, we find superstition clinging to our vocabulary like morning dew. At least in English. I'm sure readers may find similar examples in their own native tongues. The words we choose betray how deeply our superstitions run. Glamorous, stroke, bug, cobalt, nymph, ghillie suit. These words and terms, there exist many others, all, to some degree, originate in fairy belief, yet remain with us today. Contemporary culture's insistence that fairies hold no sway over us is a fallacy. Denying their influence is to yield to the glamour of modernity. Even more evident is the appearance of fairies across practically every industry. A trip down the supermarket aisle reveals all manner of mermaids, pixies, leprechauns, tommyknockers, and elves hawking processed foodstuffs. Pay attention. The next time you find yourself sitting at a stoplight, the odds are there's a gnome staring back at you from the logo of a landscaper's pickup truck. These niches offer a fine refuge for fairy belief, but none substantively change or shape culture. They don't need to, because the gentry long ago captured the true levers of power, our media landscape. Fiction furnishes fairies with fertile fields to flourish, both overtly and covertly. I have long been fascinated by how the hidden hand of fairy belief influences our most popular modern media, namely motion pictures and television programming. Fairy films, we folk on the big screen, delves into how, against all the odds, these ancient beliefs persist from the depths of time, only to seep through the most unlikely of places, the glowing screens that have captured our collective imagination for over a century. The original vision for fairy films only encompassed motion pictures without direct ties to fairy folklore. In other words, media where no fairies were literally depicted on the screen, but rather where fairy belief nonetheless bubbled to the surface of its own accord. Such is the true power behind these archetypes. Several of these essays employ this strategy, tackling films where fairies never appear, but where their influence is nonetheless palpable. My own essay on the 2013 Dutch thriller Borgman, Mark Anthony Wyatt's whimsical approach to the cult classic TV series Twin Peaks, Dr. David Floyd's Jungian examination of the science fiction classic Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Ren Collier's masterful take on Japanese horror, even the 1984 adaptation of Dune and the 1975 version of the Rocky Horror Picture Show find their way into this mix, thanks to those rascals James P. Nettles and Patrick Dugan. On the other hand, the remaining essayists picked films that either explicitly described fairies or where their presence was so obvious that it left little doubt as to what inspiration the filmmakers were drawing upon. This was not my original vision. And yet, for me, that was the moment when the fairy films finally fell into place. Focusing solely on films with oblique fairy references fails to do justice to their archetypal power. These essayists focused on how, even in their most sanitized or sensationalized forms, the core tenets of fairy belief are still preserved in these films, even if you sometimes do have to squint. The fact that genuine fairy folklore, with qualities faithful to original interpretations, can manage to push through centuries of fantasy baggage from popular culture is, simply put, miraculous. Authentic fairy belief not only overcomes their complete absence, it also overcomes what we could call fairy misinformation. We see this in Dr. Jack Hunter's personal reflections on such staples of the fairy genre as Labyrinth and The Dark Crystal, Dr. Neil Rushton's thoughtful dissection of photographing fairies, Susan Demeter's exploration of chilling themes from The Hole in the Ground, and Dr. Simon Young's rescue of the ever-contentious Walt Disney fairy tradition. To round things off, Alison Jornlin managed to wrangle several different films, both explicitly fairy-oriented and otherwise, into a thought-provoking meditation on the origins of bogeymen, another term that we can attribute to fairy belief. This collection of essays will not add years to your life, nor will it solve relationship difficulties or fill in your 401k, but it is my sincere hope, my sincere belief that it can re-enchant the way that you see motion pictures, if not life in general. So many films, whether they realise it or not, owe a debt to the good folk. Long after you place this book on the shelf, you will still perceive the theme covered herein, wherever they manifest. In doing so, you will recognise that very little about us has changed in the last several millennia. Despite our sophisticated trappings, we remain the same species that left offerings to spirits, feared the dark, and believed that secret passages beneath our feet led to fairyland's timelessness. Once you start seeing it, you will never unsee it. Fairy films will help you see through the glamour. And that was Joshua's introduction to the book, which I hope will entice you to read the book. Fairy Films, We Folk on the Big Screen, is available from all major bookstores and online at Amazon too, and in all the usual formats. This, of course, includes paperback, hardback and Kindle. Don't forget to join me next time, or sometime soon, when I'll be discussing my Twin Peaks research. If you're a fan of the show, David Lynch or Mark Frost, or if you're into the work of Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, J.R.R. Tolkien, or if you're just fascinated by Old English, Germanic, Norse folklore, or the folklore and literature of the forest and woods, or synchronicities, magic, symbolism, Bigfoot, UFOs, Cornish folklore, unfeasibly large owls, psychogeography, etc., etc. You won't want to miss it. Hopefully I'll see you there then. You've been listening to the Cuckoo Town Podcast, and I've been your host, Mark Anthony Wyatt. The Cuckoo Town Podcast is a Leviathan media production, copyright Mark Anthony Wyatt 2023. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please spread the word by telling all your friends about us, and like, share, subscribe on social media too. We're on all the major podcast platforms and YouTube too. We'll see you next time then, when we take another stroll together down a road less travelled. Thanks for listening. Be lucky.
Be lucky.
She's a pretty bird, she warbles as she flies, but she never hollers cuckoo until the 4th day of July. Jack of diamonds, Jack.